Hey everyone, so in this module we're going to talk about participant assignments. So this is the fourth module in our incentive compensation training. We started off with an overview of the SPM suite, and we spent the bulk of the last couple modules talking about compensation plans, talking about the ways that comp plans are designed in the system, as well as we went through an exercise of building a compensation plan. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to talk about participants. We also use the word compensated individual. It's basically those resources that either directly or indirectly are tied to or receive a piece of a compensation plan. So in this module, we're going to break this down of participant assignments into 6 key areas. The first thing is talking about participant setup and import. So when you have new resources, you have new individuals, you want to bring in the system and set them up, we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're then going to talk about associating roles to those participants. Again, it helps streamline the process and helps with the assignment of compensation plans. We'll talk a little bit about pay groups and something that we call payment plans. And then we'll talk about assignments and how we assign individuals or how do we assign participants to plans and plan rules, etc. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is customizing for the individual, and we'll talk more about that when we get to that section. So to start off, let's talk a little bit about the participant setup and import. So to get started, the first thing that we should know is that incentive compensation can be leveraged to compensate both internal participants as well as external participants. Internal participants are people that are your employees or people that work for the organization, where external participants are things like partners or vendors or suppliers or agents or brokers or what have you. And so the system works equally as well, regardless if you are an internal resource or you're an external resource. There's 2 ways to bring participant information into the application. Internal participants are created within HCM Foundation, which I'll talk about that in a minute. And then external participants are created and then they're brought in and stored within TCA, or our Trading Community Architecture. So I mentioned a second ago that internal people are brought in through HCM. The one thing that you should note is that when you buy incentive compensation standalone, even if you're not using us for HR, you do get core HR capabilities. It's called HCM Foundation. And there are HR capabilities that are core that we use really as a mechanism to bring in new employee data. So even though you may not be an HCM customer, if you're purchasing incentive compensation standalone, you still get core HCM or HCM Foundation elements. And again, it's used as the way to bring in participants into the application. It's delivered primarily as a set of services, and it allows us to do bulk imports to bring those resources in. And this is foundational across all of the Oracle Cloud or the Fusion applications, is that HCM Foundation is one of those things that is provided standard as a foundational module across all those applications. So in order to bring participants into the solution, there's a number of ways you can do this. One of the ways, of course, is the import process. And so if you have a CSV or a flat file, you can launch a data import batch. And one of the things to note is that employee data can come in whether you are using an Oracle technology or you're using a third party. I believe later on in the modules, when we talk about the integration framework, we're actually going to go through a lab of importing in from a spreadsheet. So the takeaway here is that participant data, whether it be internal employees or third-party partners, can be imported into the system. Imported either via CSV files, leveraging the file-based loader tool, etc., but it can be imported in. Additionally, we can also call the web service. So you could, if you're leveraging it within your third-party SFA system or HCM system, and you just want to call the web service, so every time a new employment happens or a promotion or a transfer or a termination, etc., those can all be triggered events as part of the web service to bring them over. In addition to all that, the technologies, there are user interface screens in order to import the data. So I mentioned a little bit ago that one of the things that comes standard with incentive compensation is HCM Foundation. And part of HCM Foundation are these create user screens. And so here's a quick screenshot of a create user screen that I can log in. Again, this is standard across the Fusion applications, that I can log in and create a participant. In this case, it would be an employee, and then hire them as either a full-time employee, as a contingent worker, etc. And then what it does is it would then save them from the HR user interface, and then it synchronizes it back to the TCA, or the Trading Community Architecture, and then incentive compensation directly pulls from TCA in order to bring and register those as participants within the application. Speaking of the import process, so whether it be I've brought in an employee, or whether I've brought in a third-party vendor supplier, etc., all that information, and by the way, the vendor suppliers certainly could be created from import as well. They also could be created if you're leveraging Oracle's PRM solution, or the vendor supplier components within financials. Those all get synchronized to the same place, which is TCA. Once all that participant information is in TCA, there is a synchronization that needs to happen in order for those participants to be registered participants for incentive compensation. And the reason for this is actually straightforward, which is all employee records and partner records are part of TCA, but not all TCA data are records that we want registered within incentive compensation. You might have warehouse workers, administrative staff, financial teams that are not eligible for compensation plans, and so you would not necessarily want to bring them into incentive comp or have them registered in there. So there is an importing process. So once the records and the participants have been created within, whether it be the file-based import, or whether it be through the user interface I just talked about a second ago, or through web services, they all land in the Trading Community Architecture. And so there is a synchronization process, or an import process, that has to be run. And so what we're looking at here, both on the left-hand side, these are the target parameters, and on the right-hand side, these are filter parameters. When you get to the import screens to register those participants within incentive compensation, you're going to be presented with a screen which gives you a number of options, both from the target parameters and the filter parameters. And you can leverage that to tighten the search criteria so that you bring in the most appropriate people to be imported. And then we made a little note here, and this is for your reference once you start working on projects, and we'll go through this again when we go through the lab in a couple minutes. But we've noted here the asterisk sign denotes those fields that are mandatory fields to be brought in. So now that we've talked about participants, how we bring in participants that are set up in other environments, and then how we import those into incentive compensation, let's spend a couple minutes and talk a little bit about roles. So the first thing that I'll say about roles is that roles are not the same thing necessarily as job codes. A job code might be, I might be an individual contributor level 1 salesperson, or an IC level 2 salesperson, or an IC level 3 salesperson. Those are all job codes from an HR perspective, but the role might just be a salesperson. You certainly could map one for one your job codes with your roles, but you don't have to. Incentive compensation has its own entity for role, and it serves a couple different purposes. Number one, it's a way to organize participants into categories with the same or similar job titles. So all the direct sales people might be in one category, the call center people might be in another category, the solution specialists or the overlays might be in another category. It's a way to place them into groups for categorization purposes. And then the second reason it's important is for mass assignments. So when I am associating a group of people to the direct sales plan or to the call center plan, by associating those resources, those participants to a role, it allows us to streamline the process. So whether it be I need to mass assign everyone that are direct sales people to a direct sales plan, if I'm aligning them to a compensation plan, or if I'm aligning them all to, say, payment plans or pay groups or etc. So it's a convenient way to lump or to group a series of salespeople together that you can then leverage that category to do multiple things with them. And so the purpose of roles is to combine like people together into groups so that as a compensation administrator, we can then administer them more effectively. As it says here again, whether it be assigning them to compensation plans, payment plans, pay groups, etc. One thing I will note is the second bullet here, which is the assignment of the participants to roles. That's done within the participant snapshot work area within the application. And so now that we've talked a little bit about roles, let me talk a little bit about pay groups and what we mean when we talk about pay groups. So pay groups are similar to roles. Pay groups are also used to organize the sales force, the internal sales force, the third party or the external people, etc. But it's used to organize them for the purpose of processing payments. And what it does is it allows people to be grouped together that follow into maybe a series of different criteria. So for example, maybe we're going to group together those people that are paid on a weekly basis versus another people that might be paid only on a quarterly basis. So the frequency of payment might be one of the reasons that we group people together. Another grouping for payment purposes might be internal versus external. So your internal salespeople who, if they're U.S. employees, are W-2 employees, and those W-2 employees are then paid through payroll, where your vendor suppliers may be all lumped together, and instead of passing over their payment files to payroll, you're going to pass it over to payables or accounts payables, where checks will be cut. So again, it's another way just to have a fork in the road to determine who's going to be in which group. Again, it's for organizational purposes. When I teach this class live, one of the examples that I draw from is actually from my own experience working at Oracle. So like many multinational companies, Oracle does business around the world, right? Within North America, in the United States, and Canada, they have a P&L and their own budgets, their own management team, etc. If we look over in Latin America, countries within Asia Pacific, all throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, it's exactly the same thing. Personally, when I joined Oracle, I was a global overlay. And so what my role and responsibility was, it was to help with the enablement of sales performance management, and I was not tied to any geographic boundaries. So let's talk a little bit about pay groups and why this is important. So if I'm a North American salesperson and I'm waiting for my commission to be paid, I need to wait for the books to be closed within North America. And then once those books are closed, all the salespeople in North America that are on the same pay group can be paid. Similarly, if I was based in Germany or in Paris or in China, the same situation where I'd have to wait for the country's set of books to be closed, and then once that's done, then I could wait for commissions. As a member of the global team, however, not only did I have to wait for North America, but I had to wait for Asia and Latin America. And let's say there was a problem closing the books in Singapore. If there's a problem closing the books in Singapore, well, that should not affect the North American only sales team, right? It would affect the global team, of course, and so I was always affected if there was a snag trying to close books in one region or another, but it should not, the problems in one region should not disrupt the commission processes in other regions. So again, the reason for payment groups, and as Oracle as a multinational organization, there would be pay groups for each of the countries based on the books that had to be closed, and then there might be a global overlay which was dependent upon all the books being closed. So again, it's an organizational way where you would not want one person's closing of the books and getting their financials in order to necessarily delineate or to pull away from something else. So again, pay groups are just a way to organize sets of payees or sets of participants for the process of payment. Something else I'll say about pay groups, and you can see this here, is that it is only mandatory if you're running the payments module. So for a lot of organizations, and as we go through the different work areas, we're going to do something within the credits and earnings, and this is the calculation. So once you calculate your transactions, you generate what's called an earning. And the earning is basically what you're due to be paid. And for some organizations, you may end there. But for most organizations, they then want to take that to payment because payment is then the conduit that's then going to pass it to payables. So again, there is a payment module within incentive compensation, and we'll get there in a little while in a few modules down. But the net of it is that pay groups are optional unless you're running the payment module within incentive compensation, in which they are mandatory. So now that we've talked about pay groups, let's talk a little bit about payment plans. So payment plans are a category of things within incentive compensation that actually encompass a number of things. In the industry, sometimes they'll be called payment plans. Sometimes you may have heard of salespeople that have a draw, a recoverable draw, a non-recoverable draw, they have a guarantee, etc. So that is what we would classify within incentive compensation as payment plans. So payment plans can do a number of different things. They can define minimums. So I have a minimum guarantee, and no matter what happens of my performance, I will at least get this minimum payment. They can also be caps or maximums. So no matter what happens, I'm going to cap someone's payouts at $10,000 a month. And when we are talking about minimums and maximums, then the question comes up is, are they recoverable? Which means if we give someone credit for something, do we have to pay that back at some point? And so one of the things in our payment plans we'll talk about is the parameters for controlled recovery, as well as setting up the recovery and draw periods. We can set them up so that they're in sync with one another or that they are independent. As well as we'll talk about the ability to waive recovery amounts. So even though I know someone owes us money in back pay, we may waive that entirely for a salesperson. So again, payment plans are a capability that are associated to the participants and can be assigned to them. And it's something else is that they are optional. Some organizations' compensation strategies warrant payment plans, in which these are very, very handy. And for many organizations, they do not, in which case that is why they're optional. They're certainly not anything that's required. Let's talk a little bit about draws and recoverable draws. So when we give someone a draw is when someone has a minimum guarantee regardless of performance. Think of it almost like a salary. You may have heard of some salespeople that are on commission-only plans. Well, they can't live entirely just from their commissions alone because there's such fluctuations. The highs are high and the lows are low. And so we need to even that out. And so what we might introduce are something called draws. And so what a draw might be is that I have a guarantee of at least $2,000 a month. And that's something I can count on. And then my commissions may or may not be tied to that draw. And so that comes back to the concept of, is it a recoverable draw? If it's not a recoverable draw, then it's basically like a salary, which means I get the $2,000 and I get that as a guarantee. And then anything that I sell that I would get commission for is on top of that $2,000, and that's just gravy. I may conversely have a recoverable draw, which means it is recoverable. And what that means is I may have the guarantee of $2,000, and then my first $2,000 of commissions that are due to me, the company holds back. And only once I earn more than $2,000 of commission for the month, then that is something that what I would then start receiving payment for. And I'll illustrate that a little bit more in an example in a minute. What we can also identify is we can identify the recovery period for draws. We can identify when the recovery is going to start. We may want it to start recovering immediately, or you can delay the recovery for, say, 3, 6, 9 months, etc. A common reason why many organizations might delay recovery is in these scenarios surrounding new hires. You have a new person that's joining the organization and they're trying to build their pipeline and get their bearings, and so you might give them a guarantee for a certain point of time. Maybe the guarantee only lasts for 6 months, or maybe it's a longer guarantee, but then you may want to give them some runway before you start recovering them, getting them a little bit of time to get used to their new role and start building their pipeline before the recovery starts taking into effect. And then, so that's when the recovery might start, and then as well as when the recovery ends. So if the recovery does not end, then incentive compensation will continue to try to recover against the earnings until eventually the participant doesn't owe any money. And so here's an example, it's just a screenshot from within the application, that when we are dealing with payment plans and we are setting up draw rules, we're creating the payment plan with the effective start and end date. We're saying at what frequency the plan might be. We're saying, is there a minimum amount applied or maybe a maximum payment? And if there is a draw, at what point are we going to stop the draw? Do we stop it after? Is it only good for 3 months or 6 months, et cetera, et cetera? Same thing when we're creating the recovery rules. We're first determining, is the draw going to be recoverable? If no, then all of this information is going to be grayed out. But if yes, then the question is, okay, so is the recovery start immediately, or are we going to delay the recovery? And then it gives us parameters to understand when the recovery is going to start as well as when the recovery period is going to end. Now, to help illustrate how payment plans work, let's walk through a little bit of an example. So let's say, for example, there's a payment plan out there, and we're going to invoke both the minimum payments as well as the maximum payments in this illustration. So let's say there is a minimum payment of $2,000, which means no matter what you sell, you're at least going to get a minimum guarantee of $2,000. And then let's also say that for this salesperson, that they also have a maximum payment, where in this example, let's say the maximum amount that they could earn is $10,000. So let's use those thresholds to walk through an example. In January, I can see that, as you can see by this bar that's being displayed here, January passes the minimum threshold. So we've made more than the minimum, and yet it's inside the maximum. And so we're going to pay January for exactly what they earned. Let's say that's maybe $3,000. Then let's say in February, they still have sales, right? There's still commissions that are due to them, but from this graph, we can see that they are underneath the $2,000 minimum. Let's say, for example, maybe they earned $1,700 worth in commissions. Well, $1,700, although that's great, it's still under the minimum guarantee of the $2,000. So what the system's going to do, because we have them on a payment plan of a minimum guarantee of $2,000 a month, what the system's going to do is it's going to give them credit. So even though they technically earned $1,700, we might give them, say, another $300 so that the minimum payment threshold is met and they make $2,000. Then let's say in March, in the next month, let's say they did very well in March and they passed the minimum threshold clearly, but they're under the maximum threshold. But one of the things of payment plans we talked about, are they recoverable or not recoverable? If they are not recoverable, what that would have meant is, even though in the month of February, where we would have had, say, a $1,700 commission and we would have given them $300 to bring them to the minimum, in a non-recoverable environment, that would have been forgotten. We would have given you the $300 and we would have moved on to the next month and said that the next month starts from scratch. In a recoverable environment, that means we need to recover that $300 that we advanced them last month. So because we advanced them $300 in February, in March, we then are going to recoup that $300 back. So even though they earned, let's say, somewhere between the $2,000 and $10,000 range is this area right here. Let's say that they earned $5,000 in commissions. Well, we're going to deduct them by $300. So they would really only be paid, say, $4,700. And that $300 would be taken back as the replenishment or the recoupment of the advance that we gave them in the month of February. Then let's say in the month of April, we have a tremendous month and we exceed all our revenue expectations. And as such, we've exceeded the commissions that are due to us. So let's say, because this is north of the $10,000 maximum payment, for example, let's say that they're due $14,000 in commission payments for the month of April. Well, what's interesting is because we gave them a maximum payment, we're only going to pay them that $10,000. But then there's a choice within the system that says, once you hit a maximum payment, are you going to defer the payments or not defer them? If you don't defer them, that means that even though I earned $14,000, I'm only going to get paid $10,000, and that remaining $4,000 is just going to evaporate. That means I'm not going to defer it. There's a radio button that says I am going to defer it. And let's say in this example that we have that radio button on. So if deferment is set to yes, then even though I hit my $10,000 maximum and I have $4,000 in credit, as months May, June, July, and August hit, well, it looks like in May, I've hit my maximum threshold of $10,000, but we can see in June, July, and August, I'm underneath that maximum threshold. So what deferment allows me to do is, what it's going to do is it's going to take the credit, the excess that we earned in April, it's going to pay as much of it in June up to bringing us to our maximum of $10,000. It's then going to pay the excess in July, bringing us up to our maximum. And then in August, it's going to finish us off and pay the remaining amount. So again, the entire time we're keeping the minimum of $2,000 and the maximum payments of $10,000. Again, this is just a visual representation of how payment plans work within the application. Another thing to note is that payment plans not only can be applied to the participant, but they can be applied as part of a compensation plan. And so let me explain. Imagine, and I give an example down here. Imagine that there's an Oracle sales rep. And as Oracle, as you're all well aware, Oracle sells applications products, we sell database products, hardware, middleware, etc. So let's say that this application salesperson can sell both applications as well as technology. Maybe they're selling the Oracle Cloud applications, maybe the EBS applications. That's all falls within their applications plan component, as well as on the tech side, maybe they're selling middleware or Exadata or hardware or database apps. So what you can also do is, in this scenario, you might want to give, because it might be more leading edge or cutting edge applications in a less mature market, you may want to give for the app sales portion of their compensation plan, you may want to give them a minimum guarantee that no matter how much you sell or how much you're driving business, we might give you a minimum guarantee, kind of as a buffer for that part of the business. But then you may want to cap out, say, their technology sales. Maybe the pipeline is so large and you know that they're not having to work as hard for those sales, so you may put a cap on, say, the technical sales products that are being sold, but you may give them a minimum guarantee for application sales. So the net of that is that payment plans, yes, as a salesperson, I can be given a guarantee, a minimum, maximum, etc. But also as a salesperson within a particular plan, one plan component can have a minimum and another plan component can have a maximum. Or I may want to cap one plan component and other components don't have caps. So again, just another option that's available within the application. So now that we've talked about payment plans and given some illustrations of how minimums work and maximums work, as well as payment plans for the individual, as well as payment plans with minimum thresholds and maximum guarantees within a compensation plan itself, let's spend a little bit of time and talk about assignments. So assignments are the way that you assign participants to components within incentive compensation. Specifically, how we're going to assign an individual or a group of individuals to a compensation plan, to a pay group, or to a payment plan. And it's done in one of two ways. The first way is a role-based assignment, which means you may choose to put all your direct sales people on a role called the direct sales role, and then you might have another group of people called your call center people or your telesales people, etc. And so when you associate participants to a role, then you can bulk assign people to compensation plans, pay groups, and payment plans, all based on that categorization of what role they belong to. So that's a mass assignment approach. Another way to assign people to these components is through direct assignment. Maybe I have a one-off spiff, or maybe I want to create something for Sales Club, and maybe it doesn't fall under the confines of what a traditional role would ask us to do, and so I may want to direct assign people. Say person X, I'm going to assign them to this sales spiff. Or another example is sometimes you hear about salespeople that are put on plan. Maybe they're not at the level that they should be selling, and so they're given a warning, and during that warning, they're put on a temporary plan. And that certainly might be another usage of leveraging a direct assignment versus mass assigning everyone that belongs to a particular role. So again, two options to assign people to components within incentive compensation. One is you can associate them based on the role they're part of, and then they'll inherit the components. They would inherit the compensation plan or the pay group or the payment plan that belongs to that role, or you can direct assign those participants. And so the last thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about customizing for the individual. So if you remember in the last couple modules is we did a module on compensation plans where we talked about the rules of compensation plans, and then we went through an exercise of building a plan. But the thing to note about compensation plans within the Oracle system is that plans are designed in a template framework. And the analogy a lot of times that I give to people is when I go to a meeting, more times than not, I'll wear a suit. And the question may be, Jason, did you fly to Milan to have that suit made? And the answer is no. I most likely went to Macy's or Bloomingdale's or some department store, and I selected a suit that was off the rack. But to purchase a suit, those of you that have bought suits off the rack before will know this, that when you purchase the suit and you're going to be rung up by the cashier, you don't ring up the suit and then leave the store. You you're rung up and then you're brought to the tailor. And then the tailor will then put the chalk marks based on your height or your inseam or your cuff length, etc. And you give the suit, once paid for, you give it to the tailor, and you come back a few days to a week or so later, and you come back for a fitting, and you are then eventually leave the store with a suit that has been tailored to fit your dimensions. So the suit was designed and displayed on a rack of which I picked my general dimensions, but then I brought it to the tailor and then it was customized to fit my individual dimensions. And compensation plans are not unlike this process. So the process we went through in modules 2 and 3 about compensation plans, this was designing the off-the-rack. But once you design the off-the-rack compensation plan, there's a lot of tailoring that can be done to fit it to your salespeople. Maybe every person in the sales organization has different quota amounts. Maybe they have different target incentive amounts. Maybe they have different rate payouts based on, am I a more senior person versus a junior person? And taking into account those personalizations is standard functionality within the Oracle application. And so in this section right here within participant assignments, let's talk about some of the ways that we can customize these elements for the individual. So the first thing we do is that when a compensation plan is assigned to a person, either they've been assigned to them through a role or they've been direct assigned. So in an example of a screenshot right here, I have a compensation plan for a salesperson by the name of Helena Sprague. And Helena Sprague is associated to a compensation plan that says the direct sales plan. When I drill into that direct sales plan, you can see that the direct sales plan has two plan components. There's a product sales commission plan component, and there's a quarterly bonus plan component. On that line to the right of that is the question of, do you want to individualize it? If the individualize is set as no, what that means is whatever the default off the rack for the compensation plan is, that's what it's going to be inherited for this person. But as a profile setting, if you allow individualize to equal yes, then that means that you can personalize or override those numbers for that individual. So let's talk about some of the things that we can override. Well, the first thing we can override is target incentive. Maybe as a senior salesperson, you might have an at-risk or a variable component of, say, $90,000. Where if you're more of a junior salesperson, maybe it's $50,000. Or maybe when I came in from a competitor, and so I negotiated a higher target incentive potentially, before I was going to be capped in my plan. So whether it be based on different job levels or whether it be based on a number of other criteria, one of the things that can be personalized for the individual is the target incentive. Another thing that can be personalized is the weightings of the plan components. So in this example we're looking at right here for Helena Sprague, she's on a compensation plan that's what we call an 80-20 plan. 80% of her variable comp is going to come from the product sales commissions, 20% is going to come for her quarterly bonus. Maybe for her personally, maybe for her team, for her organization, maybe coming in as a competitive hire, she wanted to have a higher weight as the quarterly bonus and a lower weight on the commissions, or whatever the instances may be. Maybe different divisions or different managers want to stress different elements as a way to manage their people. So the ability to have different weights for the target. So even though a compensation plan is an umbrella of things that we call plan components, the weighting of those plan components in relation to one another can be customized at the individual level. Another thing that can be personalized are the rate table payouts themselves. So for a salesperson, let's look at the rate table here. I might have a rate table from say $1,000 to $200,000, and in that range, if for your first $200,000, you might get a rate of 0. And then from $200,000 to say $400,000, you might get a rate of say 1.5%, and then the next tier is 3%, and the next tier is 5%. But again, maybe from a management perspective, as a divisional perspective, as sales leadership, if I want to focus a group of people on something, or if I, as an individual rep, have negotiated better rates, I have the ability, again, this is an option as ways that you can tailor the suit from the off the rack. One of the things I can do is I can negotiate and select to say that each individual or each participant may have a different set of rates. Another thing you can obviously negotiate are the plan goals. So quotas or sales targets. Not all salespeople are created equally, and as such, not all salespeople have to have the same quota that was set up in the compensation plan. So you may set up a default quota when designing the compensation plan, but then leverage the quota modeling or the goal management processes to model what the appropriate goals or the appropriate quotas are for each of the participants. And then we bring those in and store them at the measure level per participant. So each individual can have the customized quotas. And simply by flipping the individualized flag from no to yes, again, multiple elements that we're able to individualize. And another thing we're able to individualize are the participant factors. So there are accelerators. There are things that for a given point in time, you may want to give 150% credit versus the regular 100% credit or 200% credit. You might want to introduce credit factors. Credit factors both for commissionable purposes as well as quota qualification. A common example is club qualification. Those sales that happen between this date and this date will get 1.5 times quota credit or club credit in order to get to sales club. So personalization is available for the credit factors and other accelerators at the participant level. And I talked about this in the compensation plans exercise when we were building the plan, and I said we got to the payment information. I said I would talk about payment made through third party later. So I'll talk a little bit about that now. If you are building compensation plans for an organization that's comping their employees, this is not entirely relevant. This is more for when we're compensating partners, brokers, third-party agents, etc. And so let's say, for example, your customer is a car manufacturer, and car manufacturers will sell through dealerships. And so each dealership is an individual company with an affiliation for that car brand. So let's say, as an example, Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes-Benz is the car manufacturer, and they have dealership. They might have Mercedes-Benz of New York, Mercedes-Benz of Chicago, Mercedes-Benz of Los Angeles, Mercedes-Benz of San Francisco. And let's say at Mercedes-Benz of Chicago, there are 20 sales associates that work there. So those 20 people are going to receive commissions that are being paid out through Mercedes corporate. But how it works is I'm a salesperson working at the Mercedes dealership in Chicago, and I'm selling as many cars as I can, and for every sale that happens, those are recorded by the dealership. And then the dealership at the end of the week or the end of the month takes all of those sales that I made as well as all of my colleagues made. They send that up to Mercedes corporate. Mercedes corporate will then calculate that. And then Mercedes-Benz corporate does not issue individual checks to each of the salespeople at each of the dealerships, because those people are not employees or known entities to Mercedes-Benz. So what Mercedes-Benz does is they will issue a lump sum payment to the Mercedes-Benz of Chicago dealership. Then the Mercedes-Benz of Chicago takes that money and then pays it out to the individual salespeople based on the sales that they made. So although the individual salesperson is the person with the heartbeat in Chicago that's been selling, there are going to be payments made through a third party on their behalf, in which case would be Mercedes-Benz of Chicago. So again, this is very common in communications. It's very common in automotive. It's very common in immediate entertainment. There's a number of use cases that this is a quite common practice. Typically, most organizations that have individual salespeople at channels or distributors or resellers, that they're getting the ultimate commissions paid by the corporate organization, and they have to get filtered for payment through the distributor or the reseller. And so with that said, that includes this module on participant assignments. The next module coming up will be a lab where we're going to go into the application and create our own participants and associate them to the compensation plans that we did in an earlier lab.